Boldwood presents Summer Nights at the Starfish Café, written by Jessica Redland and read by Lucy Brownhill and Kitty Kelly. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. With courage, nothing is impossible. Sir William Hillary, 1823, founder of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, RNLI, established 1824, originally known as the National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck. Chapter 1. Holly. "I'm going to bring out Betty's birthday cake," I whispered to Kerry and Avril, who were topping up the salt and pepper shakers behind the Starfish Café serving counter. "Have you got your singing voices ready?" They both gave me a smile and a subtle thumbs up. Avril followed me into the kitchen to retrieve the bouquet of sunflowers, Betty's favourites, while I added the candles onto the 85th birthday cake. I'd made an iced a 2-tier sponge cake, but had asked Carly from Carly's Cupcakes in town to make decorative sunflowers in a yellow 8 and 5. "Betty's going to love that," Avril said, "and so will Tommy." Betty and Tommy were long-standing favourites at the Starfish Café, which was set on a cliff top 2 miles south of the popular North Yorkshire seaside town of Whitsborough Bay. It was a family business which had passed down from my granny to Mum to me. All the staff adored Betty and Tommy, who came in most days for tea and scones. As today was Betty's birthday, they'd been joined by another favourite customer, Sylvia, and her friend Dorothy. Candles lit, I slowly shuffled out of the kitchen. "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you." My heart glowed as other customers joined in, a slight mumble over the name from those who didn't know her. "Oh my goodness, darling girl," Betty gushed as I placed the cake in front of her. "I wasn't expecting this." Her eyes sparkled, and I glanced at Tommy, who pressed his hand to his heart and mouthed, "Thank you," to me. "Blow the candles out and make a wish," I said to Betty. She smiled and winked at me, before blowing them out to a round of applause. Avril handed her the bouquet of flowers and she breathed in the scent. "Thank you all so very much. What a lovely birthday surprise." Kerry, efficient as always, already had a knife, plates and forks ready, so while she cut and I dished the slices out, Avril took the flowers back to the kitchen to keep in water. "You've made them so happy," Kerry said as we watched the 4 of them finishing their cake amid much laughter a little later. "You make everyone happy here." "Oh, that's such a lovely thing to say. Thank you." "I mean it. What you've created here, for the staff and the customers, is really special. I'm so lucky I landed a job here." "We're lucky to have you," I said. "You do realise you can never leave?" She smiled. "No intention of ever doing so. I'm already thinking about how much I'm going to miss it during the school holidays. 5 more weeks to go." Kerry was a single parent with 4 primary school-age children, and the Monday to Friday 10:30 a.m. till 2:30 p.m. term time only shift couldn't be more ideal for her. It gave me extra cover across the busiest time of the day, and wasn't a problem during school holidays because I had several students eager for the work. A bit later, I returned to Betty and Tommy's table to clear the plates and take the cake away to be boxed up for home. "You must all take a slice," Betty insisted. "Get one for Jake and Avril's husband, and save one for Angie when she's back in tomorrow. Oh, and get Kerry to take one home for her mum and each of those lovely children of hers. You'll have none left for you 2 at this rate. We've already had 4 slices, and we've barely made a dent. There'll be plenty left." "That's very kind of you, Betty. Thank you." "Are you all set for Saturday?" Sylvia asked. My heart leapt with excitement, as it did any time anyone mentioned the wedding. After nearly a year of planning, I could hardly believe there were only 4 more sleeps until I'd say "I do" to Jake. "Just about. I picked up the dresses last week. Jake and I are finalising the details with our photographer tonight, and are making the favours on Thursday. The Bay Pavilion is such a lovely venue for a wedding," Betty said. "It's going to be a wonderful day. How's the forecast looking? Very good, so we should be able to have the ceremony outside in Pavilion Court. The Bay Pavilion, just outside the commercial part of South Bay, was the most amazing building. Originally opened in the 1840s, the function and concert venue had been extended over the years. I'd attended several events there and loved it, but the biggest selling point for our wedding was Pavilion Court. The large outdoor area had a curved wall of windows, providing a stunning panoramic view of the coastline. A bandstand in the middle of the wall acted as the altar during a wedding ceremony, and Jake and I loved the idea of making our vows with the sea as our backdrop. It was the closest we'd get to having our families with us in spirit. "I love weddings," Dorothy said, giving me a warm smile. "I'm so looking forward to Saturday." I headed into the kitchen to cut off some slices of cake and box up what was left, then followed them out to the car park. Sylvia and Dorothy wished me all the best with the final wedding preparations, then headed off in Sylvia's car with a wave. "Thank you again for the cake and flowers, Holly," Betty said, hugging me. "You really are the sweetest." "You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your birthday. I hope you have plans to spoil her, Tommy," Betty answered for him. "He spoils me every day just by being himself." The look of love they exchanged brought tears to my eyes. "Did I ever tell you we met on Betty's 17th birthday?" Tommy asked. "She went to the picture house with some friends, and I was there with my brother. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Missed the film, and she's just as beautiful today as she was back then. Monday's child, fair of face." Betty laughed. "That rhymes nonsense, and you know it, because you were born on a Wednesday, and that would make you full of woe." She turned to me. "He makes me laugh every single day. There's nothing woeful about my Tommy." "There certainly isn't," I said. "But I do agree with fairer face for you. You're a beautiful woman, Betty, as are you, darling girl. And I can't wait to see you in your wedding dress on Saturday. You'll be the finest bride there ever was. Hear, hear," Tommy said. I hugged my arms round myself, feeling all warm and fuzzy as they drove away. They'd celebrated 66 years of marriage in February, and if anyone wanted to know what enduring true love looked like, they need look no further. Amazing role models for a happy marriage. I looked up at the pine trees which surrounded the cafe and car park, giving the place an alpine feel and inspiring the log cabin-style exterior of the two-storey building. It was the last day of spring today, and the colours seemed more vibrant, the birdsong louder, the sun warmer on my face and arms, as though nature was displaying a grand finale for spring and a fanfare for the arrival of summer. Lunchtime customers would start arriving soon, but there was time for 5 minutes of peace first. I sat on one of the picnic benches near the steps down to the beach, watching a grey squirrel running up a tree trunk and a couple of blue tits pecking at a feeder. I closed my eyes and tilted my head back, letting the sounds of nature relax me. With the cafe thriving, me marrying the man of my dreams this weekend, life was looking really good right now, and about time. I'd been dealt more than my fair share of heartbreak, as had Jake. I'd lost my dad and brother, both RNLI crew members, during a rescue on a stormy night just after Christmas 8 years ago, and Mum had lost her battle with cancer a year later. Jake's mum had died when he was born, and his dad when he was 9, and we both struggled in the years that followed. We'd come a long way in coming to terms with our grief by the time we met, but had taken several further steps together. And then a different type of disaster had hit when the cafe was broken into and completely trashed a little over a year ago. The sound of a car engine made me open my eyes. Time to get back to work. I stood up, brushed off my jeans, and took one last look out at the sea beyond the cafe. "We only want positive things from now on, please," I whispered into the gentle breeze. "That would be lovely."
Chapter 2. Kerry. One of the many things I loved about working for Holly was that no matter how busy it was when 2:30 p.m. arrived, she'd shoo me out of the door with reassurances that she and my colleagues could handle things, ensuring I was never late for the school pickup. This morning had been fairly quiet, but there'd been a constant stream of customers since lunchtime, leaving very few tables free, including on the large terrace outside. We'd had a couple of damp weeks, but the last day of spring had brought gorgeous blue sky and sunshine, enticing all the fair weather walkers out. I grabbed a tray to clear a couple of recently vacated tables before I left, but Holly took it off me. "Oh, no, you don't. It's 2:30. Off you go, and don't forget your cake." I gave her an appreciative smile as I untied my apron. "Thank you." Outside, a couple of minutes later, I loaded my bag and the cake into the boot of my car. A trio of 3 women climbed up the last few steps from the beach and headed up the car park. I couldn't let them bypass the cafe. "Big climb, isn't it?" I called to the group. They laughed as they agreed. "You know what you need now? Tea and a scone or a piece of cake. Everything in the Starfish Café is freshly made on site and mouth-wateringly delicious, and, let's face it, you've earned it after that climb. And the terrace is open with the most spectacular view up and down the coast." "Are you on commission?" one of them asked, laughing. "Just someone with a passion for home cooking and stunning views." They thanked me for the recommendation and, after a brief discussion, changed direction towards the cafe. I drove away, feeling proud that I'd introduced 3 more customers who, if they were local, would hopefully return and spread the word. I meant what I'd said earlier to Holly about how lucky I was to work there. I'd started in January 4 years ago and loved everything about it. Holly, my colleagues, the customers, the location, the food, and the convenient hours. When I'd applied for the job, I didn't think I'd stood a chance as I had no experience of working in a cafe or restaurant. Fortunately, Holly viewed my time as a hotel receptionist as transferable customer service experience and took a chance on me. She frequently complimented me on how good I was with customers and my ability to convince them to make an extra purchase, like a tray bake for the road. So I knew she valued me as much as I valued the job. "Mummy!" My youngest daughter, 6-year-old Freya, ran across the playground as soon as she saw me, abandoning her twin brother Jaden. "I have a Polly!" She lifted the skirt of her lilac and white gingham school dress, revealing a Dora the Explorer plaster across her right knee. "Oh, sweetie, what happened?" I asked, crouching down to give her a cuddle. "I fell over at morning playtime." "I put a wet paper towel on it," Jaden declared proudly as he joined us in his grey shorts and white polo shirt. "He made me better." Freya flung her arms round her twin and kissed his cheek, making my heart melt. The pair of them had very different personalities and did a lot of things independently, but they were fiercely protective of each other. 8-year-old Noah sauntered across the playground with his purple school sweater slung round his neck, followed by my eldest, 11-year-old Maisie, who was growing up far too fast. She refused to wear a gingham dress, apparently too babyish for someone in their final year at primary school. Where had the years gone? They talked over each other as we weaved our way back to the car, and I didn't catch any of it, but I'd get the detail later on the way to or from their various clubs. Every day after school, there was something on, but Tuesdays were the most chaotic. Freya and Jaden had ballet and gymnastics. Maisie went to junior sea cadets, and Noah, who I swear was half fish, went to swimming club. It would be impossible to manage the logistics on my own, so Mum took Noah swimming and I spent the evening ferrying the other 3 all over town. Maisie had christened it Trippy Tuesday because of the number of trips I had to make, and it had caught on. Although the speed at which she was growing up terrified me, I couldn't help looking forward to the day we could laugh together about the real meaning of trippy. Fitting in all the clubs and activities was exhausting, but I didn't begrudge them a single moment of it. I didn't need a social life. My friendships with my lovely colleagues at the Starfish Café were enough, and I certainly wasn't interested in another romantic relationship after how badly their father let us all down. Another Trippy Tuesday survived. Mum smiled as she placed a jacket potato and salad in front of me just after 9 p.m. and sat opposite me at the table in the kitchen diner at Park Lodge, formerly my grandparents' B&B and now our family home. "Just about," I said. "How was Howard?" Mum's face lit up, as it always did when his name was mentioned. They'd met through Noah's swimming club, which Howard's grandson also attended, and had been a couple for about a year now. but they were so in tune with each other that it seemed like they'd been together for decades. He's good. Looking forward to a day with the kids on Saturday. Are you sure you don't mind? It's a lot to ask. Of course I don't mind. I get to spend some quality time with my gorgeous grandchildren. Always a good thing. And it makes me happy knowing you're getting some time to yourself for once. You know I worry about you. There's nothing to worry about. I've got the kids, you, and a job I love. That's all I need. She raised her eyebrows at me. Seriously, Mum, I don't want or need a man in my life. Been there, done that, got the broken heart. I shovelled in a forkful of fluffy potato. But you're only 31. Not all men are like Cameron, you know. She started laughing and clapped her hands to her cheeks. Yes, I heard it. Not all men are like your father either, and before you say it, I know I was younger than you when I swore off men for life. I still had a social life, though. Even if you're not interested in dating, there's nothing stopping you going out with friends on a weekday. Well, most days except Tuesdays. I know, but that would put on you even more. And I don't mind. But I do. You already do so much for me and the kids. Honestly, Mum, I'm happy with things as they are. Mum was my best friend, my rock and my saviour, and I counted my blessings every day for how amazing she was. I have no idea how I'd have got through those final months of my pregnancy with the twins if she hadn't been so selfless. She'd had her world turned upside down by the five of us, but she'd never once grumbled about it. During those earlier, darker days, I'd wondered how different my life might have been if I'd stuck to my first impressions of Cameron or listened to Mum when she'd shared her concerns. I'd been convinced she was wrong, though. I thought I knew him. I thought I was enough for him. Chapter 3. Kerry. 14 years ago. When I was only 3, my dad decided that he'd rather go out drinking with his mates than be tied down with a girlfriend and baby. Mum and I temporarily moved back into Park Lodge with her parents, a thriving B&B at that point, before relocating to Huddersfield in West Yorkshire for a fresh start. Her experience working at Park Lodge helped her secure a job in a hotel and, later, promotion to manager. I'd always wanted to follow in her footsteps, so after school, I started at the local technical college, studying my diploma in travel and tourism. That was when I first saw Cameron Fullerton. Correction, that was when I first heard Cameron Fullerton. I'd never known anyone to be so loud. It was as though everything he said and did was performed to the other students, seeking adulation. Weirdly, it worked. There were a bunch of lads who hung onto his every word and mucked about with him, clearly trying to impress, and a group of girls who seemed to find him hilarious, always giggling at his jokes and stories. I was so relieved he wasn't on my course, but my best friend Safi wasn't so fortunate. "Oh, he's just like this in class too," she said one morning a few weeks into term as Cameron raced his gang along the corridor. "He's always trying to make his mates laugh. Does my head in." "Fancy swapping to travel and tourism?" I asked, bending down to pick up the pieces of ripped poster off the floor, which they destroyed by bashing into the notice board. "It's very tempting." Cameron and his mates were laughing and patting each other on the back, and I couldn't bite my tongue any longer. "I'm glad you find it funny," I called to them as I placed the pieces on a filing cabinet. They turned round, surprise evident on all their faces. "What's that?" Cameron asked. "I said, I'm glad you find destroying someone else's work funny. I'm sure that when they spent time planning that display and putting it together so neatly, they were secretly hoping that a bunch of cretins would rip it down within a few weeks just for a laugh. Nice one, lads." My voice sounded confident, but I was shaking inside. I'd always opted for a quiet life, blending into the background, keeping off the radar of the bullies. So I had no idea why I'd chosen this moment to draw attention to myself so publicly. Cameron and I stared at each other, and I braced myself for a snarky response. But our tutors appeared and ushered us into our classrooms. The following day, the posters had been carefully taped back together. After that, there were no more corridor races or pushing and shoving, so maybe my words had had an impact after all, although they were still noisy. Sometimes, after a particularly loud incident, I'd catch Cameron looking at me, a strange expression on his face which I couldn't read. Was he challenging me to have a go at him again? Perhaps so he could say what he hadn't been able to say on the race day. Safi noticed it too and loved winding me up that Cameron was crushing on me. I doubted it, but even if he was, hell could freeze over and I still wouldn't be interested. At the start of the summer holidays, between the first and second year at college, I spotted a removals van on the drive of the big house at the end of our road. The house had been empty all year, with builders coming and going, but the new owners were obviously now ready to move in. My heart sank when a car pulled up behind the van and Cameron got out the back. Of all the people who could have moved in, why did it have to be him? "If he gets the bus, can you imagine how awkward it'll be waiting at the bus stop with him?" Safi asked when I met her in town the following day. "Or sitting next to him on the bus." "Don't, I can't bear it. What if he talks to me? What if he asks you out?" "Shut up," I cried, giving her a shove. "He does not fancy me, and I definitely don't fancy him." "My grandma always says hate is the closest thing to love." "Well, your grandma's wrong in this case." A week later, I was meeting Safi in Huddersfield. As I stepped out of the house, I had my head down texting her, but was vaguely aware of someone pushing a wheelchair along the path. I waited by the gate to let them pass and could hear a man giving a running commentary on the surroundings, the type of doors, whether there were blinds in the windows, the colours and types of flowers in tubs in the small front gardens. I wondered why he was giving so much detail and glanced up. There was a frail-looking woman in the wheelchair with wispy white hair, dressed in bright colours and wearing dark glasses. The man stopped mid-sentence and, as I looked up at him, my eyes widened in shock. Cameron? His eyes locked with mine for a moment, and he looked just as surprised to see me there. "Hi," he said. "You live here?" I couldn't exactly deny it while I was standing in my garden, so I nodded. "I've just moved in up the road," he said. "Who are you talking to, Cameron?" the woman asked. For someone who looked so frail, her voice was unexpectedly strong. He crouched beside the wheelchair, adjusted the blanket across her knees and raised his voice. "Sorry, Granny, this is Kerry from college." "The one you were telling me about?" A look of panic flickered across his face. Yes," he cleared his throat. "Kerry, this is my granny. You can call her Granny. Everyone does." "Hi, Granny," I said, at a loss for more words. I didn't know Cameron even knew my name and was reeling that he'd been talking about me. "What do you look like, Kerry?" She pointed to her glasses. "I can only see shapes now, and that'll go soon, but I like to picture things up here." She tapped her forehead. "Hearing's going too, so you'll have to speak up." "You don't have to," Cameron said, his voice low. "No, it's fine." I raised my voice for Granny to hear. "I'm 5'8". I've got shoulder-length blonde hair and blue eyes, but I'm on my way out to catch a bus, so I need to go." "Then we'd better not keep you," she said. "Bye, Kerry. I hope we meet again soon." Cameron gave me a half-smile before pushing the wheelchair away. I set off, but Granny's voice drifted towards me. "Is she as pretty as her voice?" I slowed my step, straining my ears for his response. "She's stunning." Stunning? Did that mean Safi was right about him crushing on me? I quickened my pace, not daring to turn around in case he was looking back. By the time I made it to the bus stop, my heart was racing, and I was pretty sure it wasn't completely down to the pace of my walk. On the route into the town centre, all I could think about was Cameron. Hearing him patiently describe the area to his visually impaired grandma and carefully tucking in her blanket showed a care and sight I hadn't expected. And as for those final words I caught, "She's stunning," I felt completely unnerved by the fizz of excitement they gave me. After that, I saw him pushing Granny past our house at the same time every day. I clearly wasn't discreet enough with my spying as, after a few days, he paused outside and waved. It made my stomach fizz, and I found myself watching the clock the following day, eager to see him. It seemed pointless hiding behind the curtains when he clearly knew I was there, so after about a week, I started waving back. He looked so happy when I did that, bending down and speaking to Granny, who waved enthusiastically too. On the Monday of week 4 of the 6-week summer holidays, they waved as usual, but instead of moving on, Cameron applied the brake on the wheelchair and pushed the garden gate open. My stomach did a backflip as he walked up the path and knocked on the door. "If you're free, Granny says she'd love it if you could join us on our walk today," he said when I answered. "And what about you?" I'd never flirted with anyone in my whole life, so I had no idea where that came from. He smiled. "I'd love it too." "Okay then." I slipped my trainers on and grabbed my keys. "Hi, Granny," I said, joining her on the path. "How are you?" "Not so grand today," she said, her voice sounding weaker than last time. "I have the start of a dratted summer cold. Cameron wanted me to stay home, but I get so bored indoors. My walk is—" She broke off, coughing, and Cameron handed her a tissue. I glanced up at his furrowed brow and could see he was worried about her. She finished coughing and rested back against the chair, patting her chest. "It's the highlight of my week," she wheezed. "I get bored of staying indoors too," I said, walking beside her as we set off. "My mum's a hotel manager and can't get time off in the summer holidays. I work on the reception at weekends, but I'm on my own during the week." "Then you must join us every day," she said. "Tell me about your course. Cameron says it's different to his." We walked slowly round the block as Cameron and I described the differences between our studies. She quizzed me about my weekend job and my plans for the future. "I want to be a hotel manager like my mum," I said. "I'm hoping the course and my time on reception will help fast-track that." "Cameron's going to be a manager too. He's off to university, aren't you, love?" I glanced at Cameron questioningly, surprised to hear this. With his don't-care attitude at college, I'd assumed he'd scrape through his course and get a job afterwards. Aspirations to get a degree and be a manager seemed out of kilter with his behaviour, but so did taking an old lady for a walk every day and patiently describing the surroundings. It looked like I'd made some unfair assumptions about Cameron Fullerton based on a snapshot of behaviour in the corridor. I'd only spoken to him once to challenge him on the posters, and he hadn't had a chance to respond. I hadn't thought of myself as being judgmental until now. "What do you want to do at university?" I asked him. "Business studies. I want to join a graduate programme with a big multinational, maybe as a project manager." "That sounds impressive." Granny reached up and patted his hand. "He wants to be a CEO by the time he's 30, don't you, love? Reckon he'll do it too. Straight A stars in his GCSEs, you know. He's got the brains and the ambition to go far, just like his parents." The grades surprised me too, and I wondered whether the messing about at college could be boredom. "What do your parents do?" I asked. He sighed and his voice was flat as he answered. "My dad owns a construction company and my mum owns a storage business." "Cameron doesn't get on with his parents." "Granny, you can't say that." "Why not? It's true, and it's not like it's your fault." "Yeah, but—" But he didn't get to finish his protest because Granny started coughing again, and he announced it was time to get her back inside for a rest. They called for me every day that week. Granny claimed she felt no better, but no worse either. She seemed in good spirits as she quizzed me about everything from where I was born to the music I liked to my favourite colour. Cameron shared the same details for him, or Granny did on his behalf, and I really enjoyed getting to know him. There was only one subject which appeared to be taboo, his relationship with his parents. Every time they were mentioned, he steered the conversation away. I shared that my dad wasn't in my life, but it didn't lead to him opening up about his own parents. I adored Granny and told her that I'd officially adopted her as my grandma, which she loved. She was so warm and friendly, full of interesting stories and so clearly proud of her grandson. I wished she really was my grandma. We had no contact with anyone on my dad's side of the family, and my mum's parents were nice, but we hardly ever saw them. Running Park Lodge had kept them too busy during the school holidays when I was younger, and now that they'd stopped taking in paying guests, there were still issues. They wouldn't come to Huddersfield to see us because Grandma couldn't drive, Grandad wasn't confident on motorways, and they refused to use public transport. I couldn't visit on weekends due to my job, and there was always an excuse for me not going during the week, so I'd taken the hint and stopped suggesting it. "It's meant to get colder and rainy tomorrow," Cameron said as we paused outside my house on the Friday. "We might not be out for a few days. I'm working over the weekend anyway, but call for me when you're out again." He smiled and his whole face lit up, giving me butterflies. "We'll do that." "I'll see you soon, Granny," I said, lightly passing her hand. "I hope you improve over the weekend." She grasped my hand in hers and pulled me closer. "Be patient with him," she whispered. "He's had a tough life." She squeezed my hand, then released it. "I'm ready to go home now, Cameron." I stood by the gate, watching him wheel her towards the big house, feeling puzzled. Why had she asked me to be patient with him? And how tough a life could someone have who lived in the biggest house in the area? Money clearly wasn't a worry, but maybe that stuff about not getting on with his parents was. Cameron Fullerton was clearly more complex than I'd expected, and it intrigued me. On Tuesday, the rain finally let up, and I eagerly awaited my walk with Cameron and Granny, but they didn't appear at their usual time. Late that morning, an ambulance whizzed past, blue lights flashing, and my stomach churned as it pulled onto the drive of the big house. Had Granny taken a turn for the worse? If she had, it felt disrespectful to stay by the window, watching. On Wednesday evening, there was a knock on the door and Mum called up the stairs that it was for me. Cameron was on the doorstep, his face pale. "I wanted to let you know that Granny died last night." "Oh, Cameron, I'm sorry. I saw the ambulance yesterday morning." "She went to hospital, but..." He shook his head. "Anyway, she really liked you and wanted you to have this." He handed me a purple heart-shaped pendant, which I'd admired when Granny wore it last week. "I can't take her jewellery. Doesn't your mum want it?" "If it's not gold, she's not interested. It's yours." It was the most he'd said about his mum, but that small insight was very telling. "I know it won't be the same without Granny, but do you want to go for a walk?" I asked. He nodded, so I slipped my trainers on and grabbed a jacket. He didn't speak as we walked side by side to the nearby children's playground, and neither did I. The roundabout was wet, but we sat on it anyway, and Cameron pushed on the ground intermittently with one foot, turning it ever so slowly. I ran my fingers over the pendant I'd put on. "It suits you," he said. "It's beautiful. I know I'd only just met her, but I'm going to miss her." She had that impact on everyone she met. She was always so friendly and interested in people. Shame my mum didn't inherit those genes. "Is that why you don't get on with her?" He stopped moving the roundabout and looked up at me with a sigh. "I know what you're thinking. That it's all my fault because I piss about and it winds people up." I wasn't thinking that, actually. I couldn't help sounding defensive. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. It's just that..." He shook his head and sighed again. "I don't know what I'm going to do without Granny. She was the only one who ever cared. My parents never wanted me, and they could pretend I didn't exist with Granny around doing the grandparent and parent role, but now, they never wanted you. They actually told you that." "Hundreds of times. So when Granny said I don't get on with my parents, what she actually meant is that they hate me and rue the day I was born." "That's harsh. Why didn't they want you?" "Because they never wanted kids. They only care about 3 things: their businesses, their bank balance, and each other. Having a child was a drain on all 3 of those." "Then why have a child?" "Because Mum didn't realise she was pregnant until it was too late to do anything about it." That was a cheery thing to be told. I couldn't believe I was hearing it. That's awful. They're awful. They were going to have me adopted, but Granny stepped in and said she'd move in and help raise me. She did more than help. She did everything. I shuffled closer to him, not caring how wet my jeans were getting, and entwined my fingers round his. There were no words. I knew something of rejection from the situation with Dad, but Mum had been an amazing parent and I'd never felt like I missed out. How horrendous must it feel to be rejected every day and to know your parents wished you'd never been born? That was brutal. I felt bad about the posters, he said eventually. I did my best to tape them back together. That was you. I hate myself when I'm doing stuff like that, but I can't seem to stop it. One day at primary school, I made a joke in the middle of a maths test and everyone laughed. I was in trouble with the teacher, but the kids thought I was a legend. The teacher said that if I did it again, my parents would have to come into school. Back then, I still believed I could make them notice me, and here was my teacher presenting me with a way to make that happen. So I played up again, and sure enough, my parents were hauled into school. Even though I was in trouble with them, it felt good to be on their radar, so I continued to muck about, but they passed the book to Granny. It wasn't fair on her, so I calmed it down a bit, getting attention from my classmates, but not pushing it far enough with the teacher to haul Granny into school. It was years later when I realised that it had got me nowhere with my parents except to give them more proof as to why having kids was a waste of time, money and effort. By then, mucking about was a habit. I could hear the pain in his voice as he told me what I suspected he'd never shared with anyone before, and at that moment, I felt like I understood who he was and why. I pictured him in the corridor at college and that strange expression on his face and wondered if it had been his way of trying to silently convey to me that what I saw wasn't who he was. You don't need to be that person anymore, I said softly. Granny saw you and I see you too. You've got my attention. His eyes filled with tears, and that was the moment I fell in love with him. I saw a vulnerable, confused, lonely teenager, and I thought I could make everything better. I thought he was broken and I could fix him. We sat on the roundabout and talked for hours, but the darkness brought a chill and we were soon shivering. My legs had cramped up, and as I got off the roundabout, I stumbled into Cameron's arms. Our faces edged closer and his lips met mine with the softest, most tender of kisses. We spent what was left of the summer holidays together, but my relationship with Cameron cost me my friendship with Safi. She had a hissy fit when I told her he was my boyfriend. Apparently, I was making a big mistake and she wouldn't be sticking around to pick up the pieces when he inevitably dumped me. Granny's funeral was a couple of days before we returned to college. I went to support Cameron and had the displeasure of meeting his parents. He hadn't been exaggerating about them. Doug and Margot Fullerton were even colder and more self-absorbed than I'd expected. They blanked Cameron, as though he was a stranger, while welcoming the other mourners, many of whom Cameron told me were business contacts rather than relatives or friends of Granny. They didn't even leave space for him to sit on the front pew with them in the church. We were a couple of hours into the wake when he finally managed to pin them down long enough to introduce me as his girlfriend. His dad laughed and said, "Good luck with that." His mum looked me up and down, sneered and said, "I give it a month, and that's being generous." Looking back, that's when it all started. I couldn't bear to see him so starved of love and attention, so I overcompensated. I made him the centre of my world, which worried Mum. "Why are you going to see a horror film? You hate them. Why are you growing your hair? It drives you mad when it's long. Why are you watching rugby? You don't like watching sport." And the answer to all those questions was because Cameron likes it. Although my response to Mum was always, "I'm giving it a try," or "I fancied a change." I didn't mind, and it's not like Cameron forced me into any of it. I was the one who offered. He'd been ignored by his parents all his life, so my gift to him was making him feel important, especially with Granny gone. Did it matter if that meant a few nightmares, tangled hair, and several hours spent watching a sport I didn't understand? It made Cameron happy, which made me happy. Or so I thought.
Chapter 4. Hollie, Present Day. The Starfish Café opened 7 days a week during peak season, and Angie was the manager on Sundays, giving me a valuable day off. In my life before Jake and Pickle, I'd spent that day and most evenings in my workshop, the double garage at my childhood home, Sandy Croft, making my Hollie's wood products. Keeping busy had been one of the things that had kept me going through my grief. Now, everything had changed. My evenings were busy with RNLI training every Monday, responding to emergency call-outs at other times, and Jake. The only evenings I spent in my workshop now were when Jake was working nights. I still spent Sunday mornings foraging for driftwood and sea glass on the various beaches up and down the Yorkshire coast, but was often accompanied by Jake and Pickle. I sometimes had a few hours in my workshop later that day, while Jake went out with his camera or processed the photos he'd taken, but I'd really needed another day away from the cafe, spent in the workshop building up my stock for Driftwood Dell, the shop and gallery we'd opened on the top floor as part of the refurbishment after the break-in. I'd chosen Thursdays for my Hollie's Wood Day, and if Jake was between shifts at the hospital, he kept me well supplied with mugs of tea, but was otherwise brilliant at leaving me to it. It was a Thursday today, but as it was only 2 days until our wedding, I had other plans, going to Charlie's Chocolates to make my wedding favours. I'd been so excited when Charlie had asked if I wanted to create them with her. Jake was on a day shift at the hospital, so I took Pickle to the cafe first thing, rather than leave him alone all day, then walked into town. Sandy Croft was on the corner of a side street off Sea Cliff, a long cliff-top road into town, with hotels, guest houses and flats on one side and a wide esplanade on the other. And I loved the walk, taking me past beautiful flower beds and benches. Trees and shrubs lined the cliff top, broken by entrances to the various cliff paths down to South Bay, some of which twisted through woodland, and others which went via Cascade Gardens, a hidden gem of a garden which had been a favourite haunt of Mum's, and where I was going to have some photos taken before my wedding. At some points, the trees weren't quite so dense, providing glimpses of the sea, but my favourite part was where the trees ended. Reaching that spot now, I paused to drink it in, the curve of South Bay, with the ruins of Whitsborough Bay Castle perched on the distant cliff top, and the River Appleby weaving its way to the sea below. There was the old town, where Jake had lived in Lighthouse View when we met, but which he now rented out to our friends Tory and Finlay. The colourful frontages and flashing lights of the arcades overlooking the beach contrasted with the candy-coloured ice cream parlours. On the same side as the beach was a small fair called Pleasureland, the harbour and the lifeboat station. The D-Class ILB, the small inshore lifeboat, was heading towards the station, so they must have been out on a shout. There weren't any ambulances on the harbour slipway, and I couldn't hear the air-sea rescue helicopter, so presumably it hadn't been anything too serious. The crew would likely be RT Chief Briers and Kyle Jaffa Bradbury, who were the station's only full-time paid staff, coxswain and mechanic respectively, and probably Simba, who lived towards the bottom of the old town and worked from home, so was nearly always the first to reach the station. The ILB reached the beach and the shore crew took over, getting the lifeboat onto the trailer to transport back up the ramp for checking over and cleaning. That was my role with the RNLI now, having transitioned from lifeboat to shore crew at the beginning of April, so Jake and I could try for a family. I couldn't be boat crew and pregnant as it was too risky. I'd have loved to spend longer as boat crew, but we both turned 36 at the end of last year and didn't feel like time was on our side to delay things for too long. I tore my gaze away from the ILB and continued my journey into town. I was going to help Charlie make the chocolates this morning, and, while they were setting in the moulds, I was meeting my bridesmaids, Katie, Tori and Bex, for lunch in the chocolate pot. Katie and Bex would need to return to work afterwards, but Tori was taking the afternoon off to help bag up the favours. Charlie's Chocolates was on the left-hand side of Castle Street, about 2/3 of the way up. I was a little early, so I zigzagged along the street, admiring the window displays and the various independent shops. Several of my wooden cottages were displayed in the window of Yorkshire's Best. It was predominantly a gallery run by local artist Jed Ferguson, but he also sold Yorkshire-made crafts, providing retail space to creatives who would typically only be able to sell their wares online or at craft fairs. Jed and I supported each other's businesses, with his artwork for sale in Driftwood Dell and some of my Holly's wood products in his shop. I'd been really touched when he unveiled a picture at the start of the year of Tank, the largest and most recognisable of the grey seals in the colony below the cafe, perched on a rock on the beach with Starfish Ark and the lighthouse in the background. For sale exclusively at the Starfish Café, it had been a really popular print. In return, I'd created a wooden Castle Street collection only available in Yorkshire's Best, which had also sold well. Opposite Charlie's Chocolates, an empty unit was in the midst of refurbishment. I cupped my hands to peer through a gap in the whitewash on the windows, but the piles of wood, plasterboard and the loose cabling gave me no clue as to what it would become. I crossed over to Charlie's Chocolates and pushed open the door. Breathing in the delectable aroma of chocolate and caramel, my stomach rumbled appreciatively. Charlie's best friend and business partner, Jodie, was restocking what they called the posh chocks, stored in the glass serving counter. She looked up and smiled. "Happy nearly wedding day! 2 more sleeps!" "I know. I can't believe it's nearly here." "Are you all sorted?" "Yes, the favours are the final thing." "Charlie's in the workshop. You can go through." I pushed through the wooden saloon doors into the large room where Charlie and Jodie made the chocolates and ran chocolate-making parties. Charlie appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, and gave me a welcoming hug. "I'm so excited about this," I said. "Me too. I've done a practice run. Do you want to wash your hands while I grab the samples?" We'd agreed on a bag of 3 large chocolates, a white chocolate starfish, a seashell made from a mix of white and milk chocolate to give it a mottled effect, and a dark chocolate anchor as a nod to the RNLI, whose logo included one. She emerged from the kitchen with a plate. "Oh wow, they're amazing!" I picked up the white chocolate starfish, admiring the shape of the 5 arms, each one different, and the bumpy texture. The shell, a clam, was also realistic, with curves and grooves, and the anchor looked fabulous too. "I put them in a clear bag, but I reckon they look even better with sprinkles included. What do you think of this?" She handed me a bag tied with a turquoise ribbon in which the chocolate sat on a bed of turquoise sugar sprinkles. "They look like they're in the sea," I exclaimed. "I love them. Yes, please, to the sprinkles." Charlie passed me an apron. "You'll definitely need this. Let's get creative." She talked me through each stage of the process, explaining why the chocolate needed to reach a certain temperature and what could go wrong. It was really interesting, although it made me very hungry. "I heard you telling Jodie that the favours are the last thing to be done," she said as we poured chocolate into the moulds. "I'm impressed. I was still faffing about with the seating plan in the early hours of my wedding day." "Everything has gone smoothly so far. You hear these horror stories about things going wrong, but we've had none of that, and hopefully it'll stay that way." I held up my crossed fingers, and Charlie mirrored me. "When I was getting married, I remember reading about couples splitting up because of the stress of it all," she said. "It should be fun, not a nightmare." As we continued to work, a constant cycle of filling moulds, letting them set in the fridge, emptying them and starting over, we shared some of the stories we'd heard about venue disasters, disengaged grooms, bridezillas demanding guests and overbearing parents. "I'll have the last sets of moulds in the fridge by the time you're back from lunch, and they'll be set by the time we've bagged the first ones." Charlie carried a mould of anchors through to the kitchen. "I see the unit opposite you is getting done up," I called to her as I removed my apron and retrieved my jacket and bag. "About time too," she said, returning to the workshop. "I hate looking out at an empty unit." I can't remember what it was before. A clothes shop, but they were only open for a couple of years, and they struggled from the start. Bit too pricey for Whitspur Bay. Do you know what it's going to be now? I do, but only because Matt's doing the refurb. Matt was Charlie's husband and the plumbing part of a building trades company he ran with his dad and brother. They'd done the refurbishment of the Starfish Café after the break-in. Can you tell me? It's okay if you can't. I can, but can you keep it to yourself? The new owners have a publicity campaign all worked out, so they don't want it out there yet. It's going to be a cat cafe. Oh, wow! Really? I've always wanted to go to a cat cafe. I'll have to take Angie when it opens. Angie adored cats and had two of her own, siblings Felix and Pixie. I said goodbye and left to meet Katie, Bex and Tori in the chocolate pot, but was unable to resist one last peek through the windows of the cat cafe to be, imagining how amazing it would look with walkways and cat trees. I'd definitely be paying it a visit.
Chapter 5. Kerry. When I picked the kids up after school on Thursday, we experienced the usual chaos of everyone talking at once on the way back to the car, except Noah. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror several times on the drive home, concerned to see him staring out of the window and frowning. I knew better than to pick him up on it in front of the others. If something was bothering my girls, they'd come straight out with it. Jaden would share his concerns if prompted, but Noah liked time to think things through, then discuss it privately. Fortunately, we'd have that chance tonight as I'd be taking him to Cubs after I dropped Freya and Jaden off at gymnastics. The timings meant sitting in the car outside the scout hut for 20 minutes, but I'd grown to love that time, as we had some of our best conversations without any of the other three butting in. "Something on your mind?" I asked gently, cutting the engine but leaving the music on low when we pulled into the car park outside the scout hut later that evening. Noah undid his seatbelt with a sigh. "Why don't I have a dad?" The question took me by surprise. None of the kids had mentioned their dad in a very long time. "You do have a dad, sweetie. You know that. I used to be married to him, but we're not married anymore." "Why not?" I picked my words carefully, not wanting to expose Noah to the full truth about the circumstances in which his dad walked out, especially when I'd never had an explanation for Cameron's actions. It would have been so easy to be negative about him, but I'd vowed I wouldn't do that. "Because your dad and I don't love each other anymore. Some couples try to stay together when that happens, but it doesn't make them happy, and other couples, like your dad and me, decide that ending the marriage is best. Your dad moved out and we got divorced when the twins were little." "Did Dad divorce us too?" My heart broke for him. It was such a reasonable question. "No, parents don't get divorced from their children, but sometimes one of them moves away, which makes it harder for them to see the children. Your dad moved to London, or at least I think he did, which was a long way from where we were living in Huddersfield and even further from where we live now." "But London is in England." "Yes." "So he could have come to see us if he wanted." Tears pricked my eyes and I busied myself adjusting my position in the seat so Noah wouldn't notice. Yes, he could have seen them. But the key was at the end of that question, if he wanted. I presumed he hadn't wanted to, although I'd had to presume a lot of things. "What's brought all this on?" I asked, deflecting Noah's question. "Caleb told everyone I didn't have a dad, and when I said I did, but we never saw him, he said my dad must hate me." "Oh, Noah, that's a horrible thing for him to say, and it's not true. Caleb's mum and dad are divorced, and his dad lives in Germany, but he still sees him in the school holidays. He kept going on about it all day, and Mrs. Lester told me off because I shouted at him to shut up." He should have let it go, especially when it's nothing to do with him. But you do know you can't shout at people, don't you? He hung his head and nodded. Maisie could snap if pushed too far, but Noah didn't have a temper. He was quietly spoken, and the only time I'd ever heard him raise his voice was in encouragement at a swimming gala, so Caleb had clearly really pushed him. I hated Cameron for putting me in this position. I had no explanation for why he'd cut the kids out of his life, because the last time I'd spoken to him was when he dropped his bombshell that it was over. Next thing I knew, there was a letter from his solicitor initiating divorce proceedings. I'd kept the same email address and mobile number for 2 years, hoping he'd finally help me understand why he'd left. But I never heard a peep out of him, so I changed both, unable to bear that constant feeling of hope that he might reach out. I sent him letters via his solicitor, updating him on things I thought he should know, including our move to Whitesborough Bay, and even sent him copies of school reports and photos, but he never responded. The only way I knew he hadn't disappeared off the face of the earth was the generous monthly payment direct into my bank account via his solicitor. Guilt money, Mum called it. She meant guilt for abandoning us, but I couldn't help wondering if it was also guilt for letting me love him when he wasn't capable of loving me back. Why else would he cut off ties? He had been broken, but it seemed that fixing him had been beyond my capabilities. Caleb's horrible to everyone, but his dad still loves him, Noah continued, bringing my attention back to him. I'm kind to people, so why doesn't my dad love me? I hugged him as best as I could across the gear stick. I love you, sweetie, I assured him. And so do Nana and Howard and your brother and sisters. We know how kind and fabulous you are. I couldn't keep avoiding mention of Cameron. I'm sure your dad loves you too, in his own weird way. Noah pulled back from my hug and fixed his eyes on mine. Then why doesn't he ever see me? I really wish I could answer that for you, but the truth is I don't know. I'm sorry. Chapter 6. Kerry. 12 years ago. When we finished college, I secured a full-time receptionist job in a large hotel in Huddersfield, and Cameron started his business studies degree at the University of Bath, as planned. The distance scared me. 4 hours by car, 5 by train, but there was no way Cam would consider an alternative closer to home. Bath was one of the top 3 universities for business studies, and he wanted the best. We were determined not to let the distance come between us, so I used my annual leave to book a long weekend in Bath twice a term. The longest we'd end up spending apart was 4 weeks, which was still too long for my liking, but I couldn't see an alternative. Mum was worried again. Why do you have to do all the travelling? She asked. You're using up your annual leave and it'll be costing you a fortune. I know, but what's the answer? Not see him at all? The answer is taking turns. You go to Bath one weekend and he comes up here the other. But he doesn't want to see his parents. Mum knew the history and had experienced herself how cold they could be after she'd invited them to a party for my 18th in April, and they turned her down flat, telling her they had no interest in celebrating with me because they couldn't care less who their son was dating. He'd be coming to see you, she protested. He can even stay here. I didn't want any conflict with Mum, so I changed the subject. I'd actually suggested the same thing to Cameron, but he'd said he wouldn't be able to leave until lectures finished on the Friday, and would have to be back for first thing Monday, so we'd hardly get any time together. Then he suggested we could just do once a term if it was too much, so I backed down and we stuck to the original plan of me doing all the travelling. During his second term, I went on a big night out with Cameron and his friends, knocking back far too many Jaeger bombs and WKD Blue. I'd never been so sick and spent Sunday in bed. I still felt ill on the way home on the Monday and, a month later, discovered that the consequences of that drinking session had been a little more enduring than a 2-day hangover. I'd never thought about vomiting making the pill less effective, but it made sense. No time to absorb into the body. I was all fingers and thumbs as I unboxed the pregnancy test, but a feeling of calm washed over me at the sight of the positive result. I was going to have a baby. For as long as I could remember, I'd wanted children. I'd babysat our neighbours' 2 young kids since I was 12 and found them such a joy to be around. I hadn't imagined starting my family quite so young, But the prospect of being a teenage mum didn't scare me. The only thing that worried me was how Mum and Cameron would react. As the father, Cameron should be the first to know. But this wasn't the sort of news to give over the phone, and with no more trips to Bath planned, I needed to wait until he was home for the Easter holidays. His potential reaction occupied most of my waking thoughts. Much as he hated being compared to his parents, Granny had been right when she said that he'd shared their ambition to succeed. He was so driven, and during the 18 months we'd been together, I'd learned that if he was going to do something, he had to excel at it. Top grades, top university, big plans for a graduate job. His parents hadn't wanted a baby getting in the way of their career.